much appreciate. My name is Jessica Gorham, and I'm the Regional Emergency GBV Advisor, working on behalf of the Gender-Based Violence Area of Responsibility, which is the global coordination mechanism for gender-based violence in emergencies. And you might know us at country level as the GBV subsector or the GBV working group or a GBV subcluster. And so I'm joined today by my colleague Akiko, who you'll hear from in just a few minutes. But before I give the floor to Akiko, if we could please put our microphones on mute throughout the discussion, I would appreciate it. If you'd like to answer a question, you can raise your hand. If you go down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see it could pop up on yours, or if you go to more, you'll see lots of different settings there. Or if you unmute your microphone, I will then call your name. My other ask, or if you could do me another kindness, if you could please put your mic or your videos, turn your videos off. I'm going to put mine on right now so you can see me only. Hi, everyone. But throughout our discussion, if everybody could make sure to turn their videos off, because I know that many of you are joining us from places that don't maybe have the strongest connection, and we want to make sure that you have the best opportunity to be able to listen in today. So first, if you could keep your microphones on mute, we would appreciate it. And then also, if you can please turn your videos off, that would also be appreciated. If you have questions throughout the next 2 hours, please feel free to write them in the chat. I'm really pleased to be joined by my colleague Shiva, who is sitting in Geneva, and she is sharing her screen with us today, because even myself sitting in Nairobi, I sometimes have different loads in terms of Wi-Fi. So we are very grateful to Shiva for providing all our tech support, and then also she will be monitoring the chat, as well as I mentioned my colleague Akiko, who is the subsector coordinator based in Sudan. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to write them in the chat, but you can also unmute yourself, and I will call on you because I'm monitoring the participant list so I can see when you're unmuted, or else you can raise your hand. I am going to be speaking slower, and I'm going to try and enunciate better, because I know probably most of you on the line, English is a second language. So I want to make sure that I'm not speaking with my American accent. So for those of you listening, you might notice that I'm speaking slower and I'm enunciating words more. And that's just in an effort so that everybody can understand English better, because I know that unfortunately my language skills are not what they should be. So I wish that I could present this in Arabic. But we are fortunate that for those colleagues who feel more confident listening and participating in this presentation, we will be rolling out this series in Arabic as well. And that will be our colleague Noha. So we are doing the first set of series in English, but then you'll also have an opportunity to listen to these recordings, which will be in Arabic as well. If you would like, at the end, we will be uploading this training as well as any others to our YouTube channel, which is for the GBV AOR. So before I get started, I'm just going to turn it over. Well, first, everybody, I'm going to turn it over to, I'm going to turn off my video because I want everybody to have the same potential to log in. And then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Akiko just to give a few words of welcome on behalf of the GBV subsector in Sudan. Over to you, Kiko.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session. This is Akiko. I'm a GBV subsector for Sudan, coordinator for GBV subsector Sudan. Thank you so much, Jessica, for organizing this session. Everyone, Jessica is a regional advisor covering multiple countries, including Sudan, and giving guidance for us coordinators, GBV AOR coordinators. So I really appreciate, this session, which is really crucial at this timing. We are hearing a lot of, stories, testimonies, from the field that there has been a significant challenges with securing, safeguarding the food distribution, so, this is really an opportunity to come together to think what we can concretely do to mitigate these risks. This is just the beginning of our joint efforts, but I hope this will be a very fruitful session, and I hope you can I hope that to see active participation. We see so many people registered in advance, and we really appreciate it. And also big thanks to Shiva, our colleague in Geneva, for coordinating and organizing, setting up, the links and, organizing this session. We really appreciate, since we are in the location where is a limited internet bandwidth. So without further ado, let us, hand it back to Jessica. I'll turn off my video, but I'll be here and I'll be assisting, with monitoring chat and also sharing some very interesting resources and useful resources for you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Akiko. I think we'll just get started. So Shiva, next slide, please. So I hope that all of you today who are on the line were able to join us for our trainings that we had last week on the Pocket Guide. So last week we hosted 2 trainings on the Pocket Guide. And this, Hawida, I like this. I see some yeses in the chat, which makes me feel very good. We had over 100 intersectoral specialists join us last week for one of those 2 trainings, which is great. And this reflects back on key responsibilities for food security and livelihood and agriculture actors. So we have 2 main ones. The first one is we would like for you to be prepared to respond if a survivor comes to you for help. So we would like you to have updated referral information and understand how to provide safe and appropriate referrals to services or individuals that are trusted. So for this was the focus of last week's Pocket Guide training. And Akiko has put the link in the chat for that training. So that if, unfortunately, because it was amazing, if by chance you did not sit in on that training, you still have the opportunity, and you can look for it through the link or via our YouTube channel. And it's the Pocket Guide for Sudan. Again, that's the first responsibility, which is we would like you to be able to link a survivor or someone at risk of violence to an appropriate service or a helper in their community if they approach you while you're doing your work. So we're not going to focus on that first priority so much today. What we are going to focus on today is that second priority or responsibility. Can someone read out what that second bullet point says? I'm also okay with selecting volunteers, but if you put yourself unmuted, you can read the second bullet point. How about Abbas? Abbas Harun. Can you help us? Abbas. Or I saw someone else go unmuted. How about that second one? Yeah, go ahead. Hey there. Yep. Nuseba, go ahead.
Implementing programming
Go ahead. I think we're losing.
implementing programming in a way that minimizes GBV risk.
Yeah, exactly. So today we're going to focus on our second key responsibility as food security, agriculture, livelihoods actors. And that's implementing programming that minimizes GBV risks. But before we get to that second one, let's talk a little bit about that first responsibility. Shiva, next slide, please. For those who have missed it, we're going to show a short video that summarizes the key points that came out of that pocket guide training last week. So let's take a few minutes and just refresh our memories about some of the key points that came out from the training last week on the GBV pocket guide. Go ahead, Shiva. Thanks.
Gender-based violence is among the most widespread forms of violence. Women and girls are especially vulnerable to GBV, but it can also affect boys, men, adolescents, elderly people, and those with disabilities. This film is for humanitarian workers who may meet people disclosing GBV incidents during humanitarian crisis. GBV incidents are often hidden, and supporting survivors is always complex and sensitive. If a survivor approaches you and discloses an incident, ensure that any urgent needs receive immediate attention and that you're both safe. Listen carefully and treat any information given as confidential. Do not ask details. Do not record any information about the incident or the survivor. Inform the survivor of the options available to them. Only share accurate and up-to-date information about services available in the area and explain how to access them. If you are asked to help contact any type of service, the survivor must understand and agree to who will be informed and what will happen next. This is informed consent. If they give their consent, follow the referral pathway defined by GBV specialists in your area. Respect the survivor's choice. Do not counsel them or try and force assistance. Do inform them that help can also be sought at a later stage. Regardless of if a survivor chooses to access services or not, do not share details of the incidents or personal identifiers unless the survivor asks you to do so. Remember the key principles of safety, consent, confidentiality, and respect. You can only offer support if the incident is disclosed directly to you by the survivor. Under no circumstances should you look for GBV survivors. This can endanger them and yourself. If someone other than the survivor approaches you, give them information about available assistance that they can share with the survivor. Explain that safety and confidentiality must be preserved. Training and guidance from GBV specialists are essential to understand how you can assist survivors safely. Ask your manager what's available. You and your team should also be familiar with your agency's code of conduct and know that any sexual exploitation or abuse by humanitarians is strictly prohibited. If unsure of what to do at any point, seek advice from a GBV specialist whilst upholding confidentiality.
Great. Thanks, Shiva. What are some of the main points that you saw in that video? Fadal, I see you're unmuted. I'm assuming that means you have some main points. What do you think? Abdul Karim. Or you can write in the chat too. What are some of the key takeaways from that video, which was on the pocket guide on how we engage with a survivor or someone at risk of violence if they approach you while you're doing your work? Any ideas? Feel free to write in the chat as well. Yeah. Oh, Dahlia, hi. What do you think?
Hello, everybody. I think that our responsibility is not to engage in this situation, either physically or emotionally, or reporting or something like that. Our role is guidance and how to keep the safety of the people wherever we are working. To give a guidance, to give information, full information about everything, and do not investigating, don't investigate the cases, do not engage in any.
Exactly. Great, Dahlia. That's a perfect answer. Yeah, and I see some good responses and feedback in the chat as well. So it could be you're meeting the survivor's immediate need, which could merely be information. It could be that you provide water or link them to an appropriate service or service provider who can actually help them work through what some of their issues might be. I see a couple, Hafiz, you've mentioned confidentiality. I would get that tattooed on my forehead if I could. Yep, confidentiality, really important. Treating information with confidentiality. And safety. Sally, you mentioned safety. This is part of the reason we don't take any case notes. We are not GBV case managers or case workers. What really our expectation from all of you is that you merely treat a survivor or someone at risk of violence with dignity and respect. And if they agree, which is if they consent after you inform them of all of this, you link them to an appropriate service or individual. It could be a teacher, it could be a trusted women's group leader, or it could be a GBV service provider, depending on your location. And that point of confidentiality is so important because it ensures the safety of the survivor, but it also ensures your safety. We've had many examples of seemingly good intentions that turn into something that's really unsafe in terms of retaliation and other things. Yep. Avoid disclosure of any information, respect the survivor's wishes. And Akiko put in the chat a link to our GBV focal points in every location that we have at state level. So if you are confused or you're not feeling confident about who you would link to, reach out to that focal point at state level and they can help you, particularly more so your organization, understand who you should be linking to. And Dahlia had a question about what if it is a child? Really great question. I would really recommend that you download the Pocket Guide because we do have an entire section on if it is a child survivor, because we do have special considerations for children. We would need to find a trusted adult. Or you can go onto our YouTube channel and find the Pocket Guide training, where we also addressed making sure that we have the differences between a child and an adult. But good question. Any other main points that came out of that video? Akiko, anything I missed from the last week that you thought was important, just as a reminder, because I know everybody has attended last week. Anything, Akiko, that you can just reinforce from your side?
No, nothing from my side, but just the point that you mentioned, on when there's no services nearby, what you can do is also to ask the survivor if they are comfortable talking to someone they trust, or some local organization, local women organization, led organization, they can trust. Of course, we GBV subsector will do everything to to make sure that they access to services, together with partners. But sometimes the service locations are very, very far, and it may take time. And our concern is that they may lose their motivation to be to seek services. They get disappointed and stop seeking services. And this is one of the risks we have. So meanwhile, what you can also do, which you can you find in the Pocket Guide session as well, but is to let them talk to someone they trust or some organization they trust. Over from me. Thank you, Jessica.
Thanks, Akiko. That's a really good reinforcement of one of the points that come out of the Pocket Guide. So good. As we mentioned, food security, livelihoods, we all have two responsibilities, or what we would promote as two responsibilities in terms of mitigating or reducing risk for survivors or those at risk of violence. The first one is to link them if they agree. And then now today we're going to talk about that second one, which was, we read that second point, is that it's to minimize risks in our programming or in our interventions, because we can inadvertently create more risk for a woman or girl or a man or a boy due to our interventions. And Hawida, you're saying, should we show sympathy or encouragement or emotions? And it's not about not showing any emotions. We can show empathy for someone who is a survivor or someone at risk, but it's really important for us to know our limitations and make sure that the sphere or the breadth of our engagement is merely about linking them to someone they trust or a trusted organization. And as Akiko had mentioned here in the link, it does actually address that really well as well in the Pocket Guide. So please do read the Pocket Guide. Okay, but now let's move on to the focus of this training / discussion, which is really about how are we going to address mitigating GBV risks into your sector? Because there's a lot, to be honest. I can be frank here, but many of the risks, the majority of the risks that we encounter, GBV risks in an emergency, specifically deal with or are related to food insecurity in some way or another. This is why it's so important that we have you listening today. So just think of that. Many of the risks, I'm going to say the majority of the risks that women and girls encounter in an emergency are directly related to food insecurity. So think about that for a minute. And you identified a lot of those risks. So let's talk a little bit about what we mean. Next slide, please. For this, as we mentioned before, we have a pocket guide that shows us how to deal with that first responsibility. And we also have guidance that will help us navigate how the food security sector agriculture and livelihood sector will mitigate risks in their programs and interventions. And so we have a whole set of guidance to help you do this. This is how important it is for us as a GBV sector to get you on board. We've developed an entire guidance around just this issue. And it was endorsed by the Interagency Standing Committee. And that means that, yes, the GBV subcluster thinks this is a really good idea. But more importantly, it was endorsed by the IASC, which means the head of WFP, the head of FAO, the head of all of these big NGOs have all signed off that they said they've endorsed this and said that this would be practiced at country level. So once we get IASC endorsement, it means it should be implemented and rolled out at country level. And again, it speaks to the importance, I think. Let's watch a short video that explains the guidelines before we get into specifically talking about food security, agriculture, and livelihoods. Shiva?
Sorry, the video does not show on presentation, so I'm just going to open the link if you want to continue while I open this.
Okay. While Shiva is opening the link, I want us to think about what we mean by gender-based violence. Again, we could have an entire training on 3 or 4 days of the basic concepts of what is gender-based violence. But we don't have time for that. So I'm going to narrow it down to some key points. And we cannot talk about gender-based violence unless we talk about power. And I think this is particularly important when we're talking about food security sector and the power that you have. Let's watch this video, and then we'll come back to that concept of power. Go ahead, Shiva.
Imani is alone, in the middle of a crisis. An earthquake has taken everything: her home, her family, and her way of life. Basic community services to protect her health and security have been disrupted. She is exposed to the danger of gender-based violence, GBV.
But you can help keep her safe, even save her life. By implementing the new IASC gender-based violence guidelines, you can help protect Imani from GBV, promote the resilience of her community to reduce the risks she faces, and ensure that she knows where to get appropriate care when she needs it.
There are millions of people like Imani who are threatened by GBV. It is one of the most common human rights abuses in the world, happening anywhere and at any time.
Whether you realized it or not, you will likely have encountered GBV survivors and perpetrators during your work and in your daily life. Some are people you know.
Worldwide, women and girls face a high risk of GBV. In fact, 1 in 3 women will experience sexual or physical violence in their lifetime. This risk can be even higher in crisis-affected settings. But you, as a humanitarian worker, can help turn the tide.
You might think tackling GBV always requires specialist skills. It doesn't.
You might also think that it's not really your responsibility, but it is. It is the responsibility of all humanitarian personnel. All that's required is commitment and understanding. It's doing the work you already do in ways that are safe for everyone.
This is where the guidelines come in. No matter what sector you work in, you can help prevent GBV and help save and protect the life of a girl like Imani. Survivors and those at risk of GBV are often afraid to speak up. You can help them find their voice.
You don't need to be a GBV specialist to use the guidelines. They offer short, practical, and simple recommendations to help you identify and reduce GBV risk and implement safer programming within your day-to-day work.
The guidelines follow the humanitarian program cycle to offer useful tips on integrating GBV prevention into assessment, resource mobilization, implementation, coordination, and monitoring and evaluation.
The guidelines promote awareness and understanding of GBV, vital to developing safer programs.
The new guidelines draw on 10 years of experience and the latest in best practice to provide an action-based, effective reference for all humanitarians.
The comprehensive guidelines book is also split into 13 sectors, each having its own standalone thematic area guide, or tag. You can use whole guidelines or just the tag that applies to your sector. They provide you with positive, practical recommendations to complement your experience and program priorities.
We're all responsible for reducing the risks of GBV that vulnerable people like Imani face every day. By delivering safe, participatory and sustainable programs, we can reduce risks, promote resilience and aid recovery in communities we serve.
Start implementing the GBV guidelines today. Download the main book or the tag for your sector at www.gbvguidelines.org now.
Yes, we are going to start using those guidelines today. And if you haven't heard about them, this is our first step to making sure that we do that. And I will take you through some of the risks that we've identified in Sudan. And then, as I wrote in the chat, all of us will come up with some short and practical recommendations about how we can immediately mitigate risks in this crisis. Next slide, please. Let's come back to those key terms, power and informed consent. Who can read that slide for me? Can I have a new voice? Let's see. Also, I don't mind. How about someone can unmute? Go ahead.
Yeah, power, the ability to control and access resources, opportunities, and decision-making process. It can be both real and perceived. Gender is an important determinant of power.
Great. Can you do informed consent for us too? You're doing great.
Okay, may I continue?
Yes, please.
The second key is informed consent, making an informed choice freely and voluntarily by person in an equal power relationship. 2 acts of GBV occur when there is no informed consent. Children under age of 18 are unable to give informed consent for acts such as female genital mutilation, FGC, marriage, sexual relationship, etc. Thank you.
Perfect. Perfect. Yeah, I'm real interested in the first bullet point under power. The ability to control and access resources, opportunities, and decision-making. And I hope that we can all agree that probably the most important resource is food. Food, water, shelter. And the decision-making powers, when we talk about cash distribution, when we talk about what gets bought in markets and what doesn't, what gets prioritized. And it's important to understand, in the context of food security, the amount of power that you have as a sector over the population, particularly women and girls, who we know historically in Sudan are disempowered. When we talk about gender inequality, and it also comes to this second one of informed consent. And again, I'm going to focus on that first bullet point. Making an informed choice freely and voluntarily by persons in an equal power relationship. Gender-based violence occurs when there's an imbalance of power. And individuals, most frequently women and adolescent girls, are unable to make an informed choice freely because of that power differential. What do you think we mean by real and perceived power? This is important. Many of you identified sexual exploitation and abuse as one of the primary risks associated with your work. You identified that, right? Remember, during our registration, we asked you to identify risks. And the majority of you, as one of those risks, identified sexual exploitation and abuse. And this is really connected to power, freedom of choice. And I'm going to even bring in the second point, which is whether the power is real or perceived. And this means that you don't necessarily, Zainab, power over. That's a good way to do it, right? You don't have to necessarily have a gun held to your head. Just by the fact that you work for a humanitarian organization, whether it's the UN or an NGO or a local NGO, you have perceived power. All of you on this line, it's almost fantastical. You have the power to determine whether people eat or not. Who's responsible? Who is responsible for household level food consumption? Ultimately, in times of development, in times of peace, and in times of crisis, who is responsible for feeding families? You can write that in the chat. What do you think? Who really is responsible? Regardless of whether we're in conflict or an emergency, however we want to see it. Who is responsible for providing food at the household level? Ultimately, Meza, that's right, it's women. Mohammed and I would question, it's the head of household. Yeah, but who cooks that food ultimately? It's women. And if no food is available, who's still expected to find it to feed their family? It's women. Yeah. So regardless of how, Amal, I like that. She's like, mother, yeah, that's it. Women as well. Yeah. So regardless of how we might perceive it culturally and socially, practically at household level, it's women. Whether the food exists or it doesn't exist, it is still expected of women to provide that food. And that's a huge responsibility. And I wonder, as a sector, if we are recognizing those roles and dynamics. Okay. It was hard for me to even understand how many IDPs currently in Sudan are women versus men and heads of household. The latest, which also speaks, right? When we're looking at the expectations of whom is supposed to provide food, water, and we don't know the numbers, right? And I think the latest figures I have are from UNHCR at the end of January. And it said 52% approximately, these are trends even, we don't even know now. 52% of IDPs are female, while 48% are male. And the majority of IDPs are living in camp or other kind of settlement areas. So because of this, we are going to focus more about food distribution today than maybe on agriculture. Because we have so many IDPs who are dependent on food distribution and probably not growth at this stage of the crisis, because we have so many camps or camp-like settings. Next slide, please. So knowing this, knowing that women and girls are responsible for household level food consumption and all of what that entails, I wanted us to look at what are the risks that you have identified through your work. And I want to see if they match up with the same risks that women have identified through our focus group discussions. You can write in the chat, what do you think some of the risks are? The risks of GBV in your work. You had to write them during the registration. What do you think? Or if you want to unmute yourself. Yep, so Essam, you're saying abuses, but what does that mean? We have to be more specific. Women's lives are at stake. We have to be more specific. What do we mean by abuses? Yes, that's true in general.
Yes, I'm talking about abuses against women, especially in the camping areas. If the service provider want to provide them with any kind of services, he also requests them to offer him another thing that may he get benefits from.
You're being kind in the way that you word that, right? Can I say sexual exploitation?
Yes, that is what I mean, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I'll say it out, right? Because we have to start naming this so that people understand the severity of what we're talking about. If we don't say it out loud, then people aren't going to think it's true. Women are being forced to have sex in exchange for food or other non-food items. And it is force because they don't have the power to say no, because they need to feed their families. Limited access to livelihood opportunities. Yeah. Yep, exactly. The inaccessibility to resources. Exactly. Ooh, NS, I like this. Cultural and social norms and coming back to those power dynamics, right? And I see here, same as saying, harassment from food distribution workers. Yeah. Can you imagine? When people are at their most vulnerable, we have humanitarian workers taking advantage of that vulnerability in the worst way. And we need to make sure that our programs and our policies. Discrimination, yep. And so Amal, you mentioned hygiene. And I wouldn't say, oh, you're saying that they might have bad hygiene in order to avoid diseases. That's not necessarily gender-based violence. It's a health concern for sure, but we wouldn't categorize that as a gender-based violence. Limited access to education. Yeah. So let's go through this. I have been doing some trolling on some of your websites. So I saw who was registered today. And so I went on some of your websites to get pictures of some of your interventions. Ooh, Ibrahim, early marriage. I like this. I love what's going on in the chat here because you're coming up with some really good feedback and risk factors. So let's go over what you identified during the registration as risk factors. And I thought, as I mentioned, I would cull these from your very own work. Next slide. Okay. If we'll go back one slide.
This is the first one.
Okay. Yeah. So this is a picture of a food distribution that's happening on the border of Sudan, South Sudan. What do we see here? Take a look. What do you think? So this isn't happening in Mozambique. It's not happening in Kenya. This is your own, right? Because I specifically went on your websites. What do we see here? Do you see any points of risk for women and girls based on this picture? Yeah, Dahlia is saying it's very heavy to hold. You can see that it's taking both a man, who seems pretty fit, and a woman just to lift one of these sacks. How is this a GBV risk factor? Remember, it's about gender-based violence. What potentially could this lead to? I like Naiva's like, it's hard work. It is hard work. But what if you can't lift it? Which many people can't. What happens then? Joshua's like, you will miss out. I wish that were the only consequence. Joshua, she's not going to miss out because she has to feed her family. That's not an alternative for her. So in the chat, we say, well, that's unfortunate because she might miss her. She won't. But what will start happening? She will start negotiating away her rights. Mohammed, you've unmuted yourself. What do you think?
Yes, I was about to say it could be subject to offer sexual favor or something to somebody to leave this food to drop it at that house.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned two great points. Thanks, Mohammed. That's exactly right. This is where she starts negotiating. If she can't even lift it, how is she going to get it home? And we're saying men could support her, but at a cost. Remember, she doesn't have any money. And Mohammed said it right. She starts negotiating what she does have. And that's her body in many ways. And it's forced. She would never do that otherwise. So this picture makes me nervous. Because I think if she cannot lift that sack of food just to even get it out of the site, how is she going to get it home? And if she is the one receiving the food, she's a head of household. She's responsible for feeding her family. She's not going to miss out. She's going to negotiate ways to do that. And many times that results in gender-based violence, sexual exploitation, full stop. Go ahead, Ines. You have your hand raised. Go ahead. Ines Osman.
Questions, because here in this picture we are seeing staff who's working from the UN agency are supervising the whole process. So do you think that could minimize the risk of GBV, minimize the woman that could be approached by men to offer a support in exchange for sexual relation or whatever?
No.
Do you think it could be a sort of
a deterrent
measure?
Yeah, no. I mean, ideally, but that would assume, Ines, that also UN workers do not commit SEA. And we have a lot of evidence that it's not just implementing partners, but even among ourselves. If we look at the DRC, if we look at Haiti, we know that sexual exploitation and abuse happens across all agencies. But let's think of what you're saying here. Could it be, and someone mentioned this, right? Abdul Mahid said, all food distributors are male. And you can tell he's like, there's already negotiations going on, right? So Ines, let's say this, but could it be better if there were female workers in this picture? Whether they're in the UN or an NGO, it looks like World Vision here, right? Yes. Yeah. So it's not enough to say, is it okay if the UN is present? Because somehow they will be at a higher standard. Because we know that's not always the case. We can't assume that the UN is also upholding all of these rights. But I would say one very practical intervention for this distribution is that we would have more females present. And studies have shown that when there are more females present at the distribution, there is less likelihood of sexual exploitation and abuse. That's a practical thing that can be done, right? Yeah, I like that in the chat we're seeing, right? All of these. And we're saying, okay, I heard some of you are like, well, let's get some of these kids involved. But equally, they could also be exposed to gender-based violence. And also, when kids are part of distributions, they're not in schools. Someone else mentioned that it doesn't seem to be near anything, that this seems to be quite a rural distribution. And I would agree with that. That means there's definitely transport involved. So one of the things that you all mentioned, remember, I picked these photos because they're based on what the risk factors you identified. And one of them was sexual exploitation and abuse at distribution points, either due to a various factors. And many of you mentioned transportation as sort of a way for that to take place. Others of you mentioned that the men, right, are, and here it's so obvious. I think all of these men, and you can see them, they're visible, they're wearing visibility, right? Okay, let's go on to the next one, please. Okay, here's another one. Again, this is a food distribution that happened on the border with Chad. That previous one was in May. This is April. What do we see here? What do you think? I feel like we're seeing negotiations going on in this one. I like what Isam is saying. We can organize them in 2 queues and give priority to 2 women, then 1 man from another queue. Yeah, Ines, right? I mean, this picture is showing they're already negotiating. I like Nusaba's like, but they're organized. The sacks are organized. I guess so. What else do we see here? What do we see? Anybody? Is there anything in this picture that makes you nervous? Hanan, male dominance. This one I think is, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm seeing some people, they are sitting under the truck, and I think it's very sunny. And but also the men, they took the power to sit under the truck, the only shade available.
Yeah, and we see also, right, Mohammed, like look at all these men along the side here, right? And Nuseba, yep. I mean, these few women in the front here, I would be pretty intimidated. They're obviously negotiating something here. And we know that humanitarian assistance doesn't have to be negotiated. It's yours, free and clear. So let's look at this picture. What is a practical way that we could reduce the risk at this food distribution? What do you think? What's a practical way we could reduce risk at this? Using cards. Okay, so that would make it more orderly. All right, what else? So some are saying, well, this one looks a bit better than the last one because it seems to be on the edge, at least, of a settlement, which is good. Yeah. So Amia, you're saying there's no organization. Yep. So we could certainly reduce risk by making the distribution more organized so that women don't have to negotiate organization, right? So that we're able, so that they have equal power. Right now, I wouldn't say there's equal power in this. And so, yes. Ooh, wait a minute. Hanan, have volunteers from the population to oversee the distribution. That's a good one. Okay. There should be distribution points. If someone wants to speak off mic, feel free, because I'm just going through the chat here, but feel free to also speak if you want to unmute, if you have an important point. Go ahead, Abdallah.
Yes, hello. Actually, I guess this is an emergency food distribution, but at normal, the food distribution should be on a distribution point where there's a shelter to keep the beneficiaries on the shelter, and there's a specific registration place where beneficiaries should be registered, and the team on ground to deliver the food to the beneficiaries. But I guess this is a picture of emergency food distribution where Sudanese people who fled to Chad border. How about you?
Okay, Adam, but I'm going to challenge that. We know that women, men, boys, and girls are most vulnerable during emergencies. Does that mean then that it's more important just to get the food out? There are ways, even in an emergency distribution, that we can mitigate risks if we are thoughtful. And we've already mentioned some right here, making sure that we have organization. And that could mean that you have separate lines. So let's not use, because I hear this a lot, let's not use, well, it's an emergency as an excuse. No woman should have to trade her body or be sexually assaulted or physically assaulted just to get food. And the excuse shouldn't be, well, it's an emergency. One human right does not supersede another. She has a right to be safe and secure. And we can't take away that right in an emergency. I mean, we work in emergencies. We should have this down up to a science. If anything, it's even more important that we think about the risks to women and girls at this stage, where they don't have any support networks in place. It's us. It's all of you on this call. You're the ones who need to be aware of that. Okay. Next slide. And so already we're identifying practical interventions. Someone said, Joshua, I saw your hand. I'm going to come back to you. Someone said we should have more females, either volunteers or workers, at these distribution sites. Excellent. Someone else said we need to make sure that we have separate lines or a prioritization. Which brings us to actually this next picture. So this next picture is actually something that was identified by women in the community. Women in the community noted that during food distribution, they are always pushed to the back of the line. That men are always and have the power, right? This is why we have to always come back to that concept of power, that men have the power to go first. And so I put this in specifically because it's another picture from one of your distribution sites, and it clearly shows that here, right? And what does that mean? Why is that a GBV risk? That means that all women are now being distributed at the same time, which could mean at the very end of the day, which means they're not able to meet their obligations for food prep, we haven't even gotten into firewood yet, right? For water collection, which can lead to a whole other set of GBV. So just note, this is what's coming out of assessments that we have done as well. That even when there are lines, there's an issue about power of who goes first. And is it prioritized based on vulnerability or need? Okay, next slide. Ooh, Why did I put this one, do you think? What do you think? Because you all identified this as a risk factor. Anybody? What do you think? So this is what a lot of you identified during the registration as a risk for GBV when you talk about food security. If you have an idea, you can write in the chat or you can unmute yourself. What is this about oil? What do you think? Why did you identify this as a risk factor? I, of course, have some ideas, but I'd like to hear from you or those who wrote it. What do you think? Any thoughts? No one? Oh, okay. Hawida, what do you think?
I think this lady is working as a distributor, and I think she's in a big risk of being accused of being, I don't know, she's doing this, she's doing that, she's giving more to some person, and then her safety will be in big danger.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah, but I think it's actually more about the bigger issue is that all of these women on the outside here need oil. You can't cook the food without oil. So, and many of you didn't even mention that in the previous pictures. I didn't see any oil being distributed along with those rations. And we know that you can't cook it without oil. So what happens? Remember, women are responsible not only for gathering the food at the distribution site, but then cooking it. And can they cook food without oil? What do we see here? These women are surrounding this seller. So actually, I don't think the market worker is probably the most at risk. But look at the women surrounding her. We have one in the background, right, distributing her food in order to get oil. What's the risk? What is the GBV risk here? What if you don't have any money? What happens? You start negotiating. You start negotiating with what you do have. And that's part of your food ration or your body. Yeah, Mona, yep, sexual abuse. Sexual exploitation. You can't cook the food unless you have the right supplies. So maybe at the distribution point, we think we're doing everything really well. But you can't eat uncooked rice or grains. It's not possible. That's only one step in this chain. Imagine the negotiation and the thought process that women and girls have to go through just to be able to provide food for their families. Distribution's not enough. They have to figure out a way to get the food home. Oh, wait a minute. How are they going to cook the food? Yeah, Zuhal, sexual exploitation. So here we see from this picture, again, I got it from your websites, that even here in the background, you see that people are negotiating with their food rations to be able to get oil. As we mentioned, you can't eat uncooked food. Adam, go ahead. Abdallah.
Yeah. Sorry, just want to comment on this, especially on the food components. As WFP, there's some beneficial categories where they receive food entitlement or full component of the food, but there's some point there are categories where they receive less food component based on their vulnerabilities. I I assume that, and I agree with you, poverty as all it is a way that GBV can occur, especially those who are very poor women. But only not having oil within food component, it is a risk to GBV, is less meaning. As I work with the WFP for resilience unit, we have like food for asset programs, and we have only 2 commodities for that kind of beneficiaries, and which we categorize that they are less vulnerable than other categories where they're receiving 6 commodities on one time. Over.
Okay. So let's break that down from a WFP perspective, which I appreciate, Abdallah, Adam. Good. So yes, it should be part of a package. But what we find is that it's not always. And in emergencies, we often have women who literally are 1 cup of oil away from slipping into priority or vulnerability. And so I think we need to really be careful about how we're identifying who gets and doesn't get as well. So I think it's good that that exists. But what we saw in the other 2 pictures is that often, and you might have a specific distribution, but often in emergencies, oil, fuel source, and food are not distributed as one package, generally. And that's what we're dealing with today. And that's a problem. So let's see, we have others. I'm going to, Akiko, if you want to, maybe we had some people writing very quickly in the chat. Do you want to give any summaries of our discussion from the chat? In case I missed anything?
Yes, I mean, I think you captured everything, but like what we heard from like colleagues, I mean, like colleagues, GBB colleagues also, regarding the issue is really, lack of engagement of women, location of the distribution point being unsafe. I know that it's really difficult to identify the right location in this kind of security situation, and super crowded IDP camps, that often becomes the challenges. I think that could be solved by engaging women, long queue, long traveling distance, and also women being pushed behind the queue because they were mixed queues. So yeah, and then I think what are mentioned in the chat are more or less similar to what we identified prior to the training. Over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Akiko. Let's do a couple more photos and then we'll move on to the tag. As you can see, I'm very passionate about this subject because we can mitigate these risks. We can do this. We can make women and girls safe by some simple practical interventions. This one, I have to tell you, this one frustrates me. This was probably after sexual exploitation and abuse, when I see the top 3 risks that you have identified, and you are all from the provider perspective. You identified sexual exploitation and abuse from a distribution perspective. And then probably the second one was this, firewood. I've said it before. We are putting people on Mars, and we can't figure out how to provide firewood so that women aren't being raped on a daily basis. I started my career 20 years ago, and guess what was an issue then? Firewood. 20 years later, and we have not made any kind of progress in this. And it hurts my heart. Right now in Sudan, women are being sexually assaulted on their way to get firewood, on their way back from getting firewood. This is a truth. And who's responsible? Who? We are distributing uncooked food. They need other products to cook that food, and they need firewood. They need a fuel. Who's responsible? That's what I want to know. Who in our humanitarian community is responsible for making sure that households have the fuel source they need to be able to cook the food to feed their families? I'm going to put that out there. I think it's partly, I'm going to say it, it's food security sector. I guess the thing is the intention for them simply to receive food, or is the objective for them to be able to eat the food? I know, Isam, she is carrying a baby on her back. Both women are, if you see it. Yeah, Ilona, that's exactly right. We can have an integrated package. Food security, NFI, but we have to think about it. It frustrates me that we don't even think about how this food is going to be cooked. And every one of us on this call today knows that this is an issue, that women are being raped on their way to get firewood, to use the food that you're distributing to them. Mona, I see that you are unmuted. Do you have something to add, Mona? Okay, maybe not. If I see that you are unmuted, I'm going to assume that you're going to give us some feedback. Okay. Firewood is what are some practical ways? Yeah, Zuhal, what's a practical way that we could mitigate this risk? Go ahead, Zuhal.
Okay, for me, in order to solve such kind of problems, without getting the charcoal and any other things, why we can make business for those women and make women themselves as agents for the microfinance institutions. This will make the income for them to be higher, and it can be assistance for the other women with their environment. Thank you. Over to you.
Okay. Yes, and that might be a longer term solution, but I like what I'm seeing here also in the chat, right? Some of you are saying, what about alternate fuel sources? And it's interesting because I think there's a lot of good sort of interesting things around alternate fuel sources, but somehow they don't seem to have the uptake that we need. How about Hafiz? I see that you have your hand raised. Go ahead. What do you think?
Yeah, from experience in Darfur IDP camps, that in order to mitigate the risk of women being exposed to sexual harassment and GBV issues while collecting firewoods, usually in some IDP camps, the peacekeeping missions used to patrol women in groups when they're going and collecting and coming back to the camps. This is one of the examples we used to witness within Darfur IDP camps, and also introducing the fuel efficient stoves, which is minimize the consumption of the firewoods, which you could reduce also the cases of this is one of the examples.
Great.
Has been used in Darfur, yeah.
Perfect. Hafez, good. Okay, excellent. Because we want to talk about practical ways we can mitigate risk today, right? I want you guys to get off of this training and say, wait a minute, this is important. Women are being abused, and I can do something to mitigate those risks of abuse. One, we mentioned about food distribution. Great. So the other one, and I think Hafez, excellent. And we also suggest this, someone mentioned water collection, that we have supervised wood collection, or that we make sure that women are going in groups. But you know, sometimes in an emergency, when all of these social networks are broken down, we might need the organizations working in those environments to help do that. And that's all of you. If you want these families to be able to use and consume the food you are distributing, then you're going to have to look at this as well, fuel. So really good practical intervention. We're going to come back to it at the end as well. Good. Excellent. Ooh, I like this. You're making me feel really good about what we're going to do tomorrow, which is mitigate these risks. Okay, next slide. This one is just more about gender norms. And that is that many times we don't recognize that small scale farming for household food consumption is often very dependent on women who will have to go out into fields. And in this type of emergency, I didn't want to not mention it, but I wanted us to focus on this particular emergency where we have more than 70% of IDPs living in camps or camp-like settings. And so we depend largely on food distribution. But I don't want to also neglect to say agriculture and farming presents their own risks that we also need to mitigate. And here we have risks associated with going to and from the fields, access to resources, access to land. Yeah. Okay. Next photo, please. I think there's one more. I needed to put in cash. I'm putting in cash too, because in the revised humanitarian response plan, there is mention of cash in lieu of food. What are some of the risks associated with cash distribution? In some ways, it can reduce risks, right? It gives women purchasing power. So if they need to buy oil, they can do that. If they need to buy sanitary pads, they can do that. They have the money to do it. But it does create other risks. What do we think? And a few of you mentioned this. A few of you mentioned this, and I suspect maybe it's because you're working in it. A few of you mentioned cash distribution during the registration. So some of you are saying yes, that this could be an opportunity for theft, because as we see here, yeah, safety, there's lots of people all in line watching her get that money in cash. So she's going to leave this table and then walk away with a baby in one arm and cash in the other. Is that safe? Probably not. We also know through studies we have done that many times there's a linkage between domestic violence and cash. Ooh, Martha. Here we go. Martha, you can help me. Excellent, Martha. We were exactly on the same. Martha said, "What about domestic violence?" Yeah. So not only safety on the way home, but safety in her home. Yep. Robbery on the way home. Good. Yeah, and I know some of you were saying, let me see, Shirawi, you're saying that yes, that this picture is GBV and it is correct, but women prefer often cash, right? I'm not denying that. My point is we just have to make sure that we're doing it sensitively or thoughtfully and putting in the extra time to identify risks. Okay, Inas, go ahead.
Thanks, Jessica. I just want to say something because you mentioned about the revised HRP. So I think the revised HRP have been emphasized about using the cash or cash-based interventions because basically we are facing now a new type of IDBs, the urbanized migrations, which is IDB coming from urban settings to the rural settings. So I do understand how sensitive of using of cash in a rural setting and how it would be risky for a woman to carry cash. But in the urbanized settings and a woman coming from like urban area, they know how to deal with cash. Yani now we are using vouchers, we are using telecom companies to support the cash distributions. And I think that vouchers sometimes and using not uncounted, yani count cash like this one in the pictures, it's more visible and it's more reasonable for the urbanized migrants to use it to meet their basic needs, because we have been seeing a lot of يعني relief item, even food assistance distributed to the community, but in the same time they don't take advantage of it. They go to the market and sell it in the market, and flooding the market collapse the dynamic of the market basically with selling the items that provided by the by the humanitarian assistance in a low price just for them to have cash to meet another basics need they required for them. Thank you. I just wanted to mention that.
It's a good one. Ines, every point you mentioned is really on point, in fact. So this isn't necessarily a commentary on cash, because as we know, it puts purchasing power back into markets. It gives it to women. They're able to purchase what they need, just as you said. But with this increase in cash distribution, there's also an increase in risk, GBV risks. And we need to identify them and mitigate them. So one of them, and there's 2 points of risk. One is at the distribution end, and that means that sexual exploitation we have here at UNFPA, we train banks on how to do distributions. Imagine the power these guys have. And they're not in our industry, so they don't really understand these humanitarian principles. They are not held always to the same standards or code of conduct. And so we had to start that as our focus, because we were finding so many levels of abuse from the distribution point. There's always an assumption, and I think in our chat we're seeing that too, that of course once she receives it, the survivor then is at more risk. And that's definitely true, but we've also found even just from the very point of distribution. And so the point is, if we were going to be transitioning more to cash distribution, then we need to make sure we're mitigating risks. And maybe Akiko, or actually even if you go on our YouTube channel, we have lots of, and I think Akiko, maybe you want to say a little bit. Was it last year? We had a training just on this.
Yes. So UNFPA, actually published guideline. Sorry, was it GBV or Jessica? The guideline.
It was.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Yeah, because
that's us.
Yeah, it was someone from UNFPA, so it was confusing. So GBBOR actually published a list of like guidelines. I'm going to put everything in chat box. For safe cash assistance. So there's a like I think it was up to like 8 modules. There are step-by-step guide how you can make cash intervention safe. So last September, we had a session led by the headquarters CBA expert, on how we can do GB risk mitigation and cash assistance. Now we can possibly organize a different separate call on cash. I know many of you are dealing with cash. But there are specific points that needs to be discussed regarding cash. So for the time being, I'm just going to put the link for the PowerPoint presentation used for the session we held last year, plus the guideline, the global guideline on GB risk mitigation for cash. Thank you so much, Jessica.
Thanks, Akiko. And so that in itself could be a whole different training. So if you are interested, and Akiko and her team can follow up, we can organize another 2-hour session just on cash, if in your sector you think it's needed, if those resources aren't enough, because we're recognizing the transition. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is our last one. I'll just let you look at it. And I know we're running on time now. So I just wanted to, because it was mentioned as a risk, and that was by a lot of our agriculture counterparts who are joining us today, about the distribution of resources to women and girls and how this often puts them at risk. And I thought this picture was interesting because you could tell it's an organization that's highlighting the role of women, but look at everyone that's actually there. So it seemed very tokenistic to me, to be honest, right? It was like, let's get these 2 women with the machines, while everybody else in the background is clearly all the men who are part of the project. Okay, next slide, please. All right, this brings us, now that we have identified the risks, and we have briefly discussed what some of the potential short-term and practical mitigation measures are, I want us to come back to this resource. So as we mentioned, there is the big guide, which is containing all of the sectors. And then we specifically developed guidance, which is a short little handbook, these guidelines, specifically for food security and agriculture. Livelihoods has its own tag, but you'll see food security and agriculture. So this is what we call a tag or a thematic area guide. And I think that Akiko will put that link in the chat to both the bigger guide and then also this smaller one. Actually, you probably only need the agriculture guide because the bigger one is just bigger because it includes every section. And then what I also think is really important, we say it's portable because it is a much slimmer guidance. And then lastly, and this is what I think would be super relevant to you, is that it also includes essential actions. There's a poster inside here that you could spend a little bit of jingle, maybe reproducing and putting it in your offices. And these are essential actions that you can undertake to mitigate risks. This thematic guide was developed in partnership with food security and agriculture actors. So it's not just people like me who's thinking that's a good idea. These are what you proposed as good practice. Okay, next slide. And Akiko has put the link to this guidelines, and it's basically a summary of everything I'm saying now. The guidelines are really developed around the humanitarian program cycle. So the idea is for you to institutionalize these risk mitigation measures. We're going to talk a little bit for the next 30 minutes because I know we had 2 hours. So we're going to end our discussion by talking about the assessment phase and the monitoring and evaluation phase. Because WFP and its food partners do have a checklist that they develop to help us already think about some of these risk areas. And we're going to go over that in just, I think, one slide. Next slide, please. So before we do that, this is the first priority from your cluster response plan. So I took this word for word from your revised humanitarian response plan. And this, I think this is directly linked to that first section of the project cycle, which is the assessment. Can somebody read this for me? What is your priority for the revised HRP? Can someone read that out for me? A new voice. Yeah, Shaza, go ahead.
Hi. The cluster will target affected people in conflict areas if access permits, and in non-active conflict areas where vulnerable residents are hosting displaced persons. Additional vulnerable people will be targeted when the situation allows, based on the operational capacity of partners.
Okay, thank you, Shaza. Good, excellent. What do you think my issue would be? When we think about, Shiva, can we go to the previous slide? Yeah, assessment, analysis, and strategic planning. Next slide. All of this should inform your cluster priorities. What do you think? When I read this, I was like, oh, yeah, Nidal, go ahead. I see your hand raised. Go ahead. Anybody else while we're waiting for Nidal? What do you think?
I think the assistant is going to IDPs or displaced persons, displaced people, while in the community they are vulnerables. Okay, there are many poor people, which will lead to communal jealous or even small conflict or hate in the community itself between host community and IDPs or displaced people. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, yeah, generally. But Sally, I like your point, Sally, and this is what I was getting at a bit more. So Nidal, you are right. But Sally, what do you think?
Thank you, Jessica. I'm just highlighting that in terms of being more gender sensitive or even responsive, we have to just put some detailing here. What are the people that in the conflict areas, and who are the vulnerable?
Yeah.
So we need more specification. So in terms to be more specified in our intervention.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Exactly, Sally. Because, and Hamza, you said it too, no prioritization for vulnerable women specifically. And we know in this response that the majority of IDPs are women. And there's a significant number of female-headed households. And if we don't specify, if we don't explicitly state that, then what happens? What happens is those pictures we just showed. We don't take into consideration the safety and security of those who are most going to use your service. So there's an availability of the service, but is it accessible? Uncooked food without thinking about fuel or oil. Distributing cash out in the open. All of these. And so that's what my issue is with this priority. Without specificity, it means it's not going to get done. And we have examples of that throughout this response. And all of you identified those as risks. You identified them yourselves. I didn't even have to. And it's because we're treating everybody the same. We're treating everyone as if they have the same power, and it's not true. And we're causing more harm. No one should ever have to make the choice between food and rape. No one. And we can mitigate that risk. All of us on this call today, we sure can. Next slide, please. So I wanted to kind of triangulate. You've identified risks. We know generally what risks are. And we also, during this assessment phase, and we were hoping, I couldn't find any specific to food security. So these are assessment results that we got from the GBV subsector. So if you don't think you have the information, then we can find it. But it shouldn't be us doing this. As we know, it's your responsibility to make sure that your programs are accessible, not only available, but accessible. And this kind of reinforces. Who can help me read this slide real quick? Yeah, Nidal, go ahead. Go ahead. Nidal.
Okay, assessment results April 2023. food distribution sites too far from beneficiaries. Women are exposed to risk traveling. Some women have been attacked on the way back. Lack of consultation with women resulting in inadequate, inappropriate, and unequal distribution of commodities. When yearning for food distribution, women are pushed back and have to queue behind men. In some locations, women and girls need to travel for more than 6 hours to collect firewood. Travel times continue to increase due to the increased numbers of IDPs fighting over scarce resources. Early marriage. Families marrying off their adolescent girl children due to food insecurity, economic hardship. Women exploited by military or what? Militia. Military?
Yeah.
Militia. They were told to collect firewood and hand them to the militia so that they can sell them.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Nadal. Perfect. So this is what women themselves are telling us. This isn't me sitting in my regional position or Akiko, who's the national coordinator. Women, IDPs, have told us this. Women who account for more than 50% of IDPs, who are a significant number of female-headed households, have told us this. And really, it goes hand in hand with the risks you've identified. So I hope we can all agree that this is happening. And now take the steps to mitigate. Next slide, please. Okay, I wanted us to look at what you're currently using, and I'm really appreciative that WFP provided us with their safe distribution checklist for cooperating partners and WFP staff. So this is part of their monitoring. And I think it's a good sort of starting point. So if you want, you can make your screen bigger so that you can see some of this. And I want us just to maybe take a few minutes, 1 or 2, because we only have about 12 minutes left, 13 minutes left. We're going to end with this basically. And I want us to see how we can make this stronger so that it reflects also or takes into account that specificity that we need. So if you can always make your screen bigger. You can zone in. Since we're on Zoom, there's a zone. So if you're feeling like, Jessica, those words are too small, you can zone in so you can read it. What do you think? And in general, how are ways that we can make this checklist more specific that it identifies GBV risks? I'm going to write that in the chat. So take a minute to look at it. How can we make this checklist more specific so that it also takes into account GBV risks? And we don't really have to even add necessarily new questions. We might just have to strengthen some of the existing requirements. Let's start with this one. How about that very first one? We're not going to go through everything today, but this is a good way for us to think about. Let's look at the very first one. It said, did all your staff, including temporary workers, read and fully understand the following WFP policies, codes of conduct, which are part of field level agreements? I would add one more in here. What was one of those practical ways from a staffing perspective? Yep, doing all of the mandatory courses, that's there. But remember what we said. What's one way we can reduce risk at a distribution point from a staffing perspective? That isn't mentioned here. Any ideas? We mentioned this as a practical intervention that we could even do tomorrow. Yep, so doing all the trainings, but what else? Anybody? No ideas, huh? I would say, yeah, Hawida. Hawida, do you want to say that one out loud?
Yes, I would like to add more women to the site.
There we go.
Yes.
Right? So just say instead of using staff, we specify, yep, Abdallah, number of female staff. We know studies have been done in terms of ways we can mitigate risks for sexual exploitation and abuse is just by the presence of female staff and volunteers. And this checklist or these requirements are really gender blind, I would say. I'm not even going to say neutral. They're gender blind. And so that's a way, yeah, Abdallah, good. Do you see what I mean now about how we can make this checklist more sensitive to GBV risks? Let's go to the next one. And as we mentioned, right, diversity of beneficiaries is considered and particular needs are addressed. And so there are ways here that we can make sure in this checklist, because I think the headings are great, but how can we just make them a little more specific so that we mitigate GBV risks? So this is what I would also encourage our colleagues to do based on the risks that you all identified. So it's not even me, Jessica, who identified these risks. It's all of you who did. And we know the consequences, right? That is that women and girls are being sexually assaulted. They're being physically abused because of that. And by a few simple twists, and then the actual implementation, right? This is just a tool. If it's not used, then it's useless. And we saw from some of those pictures that this checklist maybe isn't universally used at every distribution. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we have a quick video on coordination. So let's talk about, we have a GBV subcluster in Mozambique, in the Cabo Delgado region of Mozambique. And they worked very closely with the food security cluster on coordination. And so let's watch this video and see what they did and see if we can incorporate some of those in Sudan, some of their tips. Okay.
My name is Giulia Di Porcia. I'm the GBV AOR coordinator in Mozambique. I coordinate GBV AOR partners who are responding to either conflict in northern provinces of Mozambique, namely in Cabo Delgado, but also to recurrent climatic shocks, as Mozambique is affected by cyclones, tropical storms, and floods in a recurrent way. The GBV AOR partners have engaged very closely with the food security cluster throughout the humanitarian response, and with support from the GBV AOR regional team in Nairobi, the global team, and of course the most active GBV AOR partners. We have adopted a number of strategies to mitigate the risks of gender-based violence that are very, very high in Mozambique. We are talking, for example, of women and girls particularly exchanging sexual favors for food, non-food items, and other very basic goods and services. This risk was high in Mozambique before the conflict and before recurrent climatic shocks, but it is exacerbated by the conflict and by climatic shocks. We have engaged very closely with food security cluster partners to mitigate those risks. We have adopted mainly 3 strategies over the last 12 months. First of all, in areas where there are GBV specialized services available, what we have done is to ensure that food security partners are included in the referral pathways. What does this mean? It means that whenever we have the identification of partners available in a certain area, case workers who are specialized GBV service providers can refer a survivor to the food security cluster partner so that they can receive food assistance. This makes a very big difference in the life of a survivor who sometimes is rejected by their families and is sometimes isolated and very stigmatized. A second strategy that we have adopted relates mostly to the areas where there are no specialized services available. So we are talking about areas in which there are no GBV AOR partners, but maybe food security cluster partners are operating. So in this case, it is critically important that field monitors of WFP and other partners of the food security cluster are trained, and we trained especially field monitors on the GBV pocket guides, which is basically the response to disclosure by a GBV survivor when there are no specialized services available. They will be able to handle a disclosure in a safe and confidential manner according to the core principles of the GBV response, which are the survivor-centered approach. The third strategy relates to the Linea Verde and to the mechanism for complaints and feedback that is available in Mozambique. We have ensured that whenever a disclosure is received through the Linea Verde, the respondents are able to refer a survivor, again following the survivor center principle, the principles of safety and confidentiality, ensuring that they are referred in the best possible manner. Most recently, WFP has changed its criteria for targeting from status-based to vulnerability-based. What does this mean? It means that rather than targeting for food assistance all those who are internally displaced, for example, or all the refugees, they have now identified a series of indicators to assess the vulnerability of different individuals for prioritizing the response. With GBV AOR partners, we have engaged very closely with the protection team in WFP to make sure that GBV survivors in this shift are still prioritized and are able to access food assistance. We have also ensured that the GBV approach and GBV priority actions are shared with the partners of the food security cluster. For example, we have done a training together with the protection cluster and the child protection AOR and the PSCA network to mainstream GBV, PSCA and protection core principles in the response, so that all the partners of the food security cluster are aware and can follow up on the GBV mainstreaming priorities.
Great. Okay, we only have 2 minutes before the end, and so I want us to go, I think I have one slide left. Yeah, I want us to bring it all together. In these last 2 minutes, what can you do tomorrow to mitigate these GBV risks? What can you do tomorrow to mitigate these risks? What do you think? Women are being raped. Women are negotiating away their rights to safety and security to meet their most basic needs. What can you do tomorrow to mitigate some of these risks? I think we already have a running list, but I want us to make sure that we summarize and we close with this. Any ideas? What do you think? No one has any idea. Yes. So consult women. There we go, Hawida. I see some good ones. Yep. So let's see. Let's go through some of these. I think that we need to make sure that there are women as part of the food distribution teams, whether they're volunteers or they're staff. We need to have more women present, and you can do that tomorrow. Yeah? We need to make sure that distributions are organized so that they prioritize the safety and security of women. Zuhal, you have your hand raised. Go ahead. I think we're having a hard time hearing you. Go ahead. Hello? Okay, let's come back. Zuhal, why don't you write it in the chat? The second thing that we can do is that we can revise the checklist that is being used so that it is not gender blind, but there's some specificity to it as well. Okay, Shaza, I see that you are off mic. Do you have a suggestion?
Yeah, we can back to order of our last intervention and make we fix what the wrong. In terms of the sort of the food items we provide, the sort of also in the distribution, including some women volunteers, some key people from the community to attend the distribution. If some cases need to receive like home delivery for cash for sick people or anything, so we can do many amendments and all the notice that we see today.
Yes, yes, you can. And lastly, I want us to think about this firewood issue, because this one hurts my heart. We are responsible not only about the distribution of food, but also the consumption of food. And you can't neglect firewood. We need to start encouraging all of us to make sure that, Hafiz, you had a good suggestion. In the Darfurs, they're already doing it. They're having guided walks to get firewood. If it's already being done in some locations, it can be done in every location. Because the reality is, women are being raped while collecting firewood. It's not okay. It is not okay. Akiko is now capturing some of these very practical recommendations, and we're going to share them back with you so that you can tomorrow start mitigating these risks. Women and girls need you to do that. And it's our duty, right? We are duty bearers to make sure that all women, girls, men, and boys are safe and secure, meeting their most basic needs. We can do this. We have come to the end of our 2 hours. I want to thank you very much for joining us today, for listening, and also for engaging, because we are part of the solution. Simple interventions can have a huge impact on the safety and security of women and girls, female-headed households. You, all of you, have the power to change this. That's amazing. Think about all the little things that you do day to day, and think of these small interventions and the impact it could have on a woman's life. You have that power, and we can do it. We will provide the recording to you, and we have noted, I say we, that's Akiko, which we appreciate a lot. I am going to turn it over to Akiko to say a last few words before we end our session today. Akiko.
Okay, thank you so much, Jessica, for amazing sessions, and Shiva for administrating the session, and also everyone for a great participation. Of course, this is not the first time we discussed, the GBV risks in the food security sector. We did a training, but this is the first time we do it online, and we're really happy that you are actively participating and also, actively, proactively suggesting the way forward. I think this is a really important point. It's not us GBV actors who will implement this. You can make a difference. You will be, making changes starting from even today and tomorrow. And we also have, concrete, suggestions that are showing up in chat box. I'll make sure that I'll capture them. I'll send an email after this, session, probably early next week, with a recording and, list of resources and the list of suggestions that came from you. Perhaps later on we can make, the more comprehensive checklist so that will be easier for you to check your interventions. But thank you again. Again, this is just the beginning, and hopes to see you again in the future sessions. Thank you so much. And thank you again, Jessica and Shiva.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.